And if I could just extend the thank yous that we are offering to those of you in the Kratom community, the vendor community, it goes across the board. We have seen tremendous support, and we wouldn't be in the position we're in today but for the support of vendors. The Kratom community activists and consumers are great, but we know that we wouldn't have been able to accomplish what we have done so far but for your help. And by the way, you're in a very competitive business. It's not easy sometimes to get competitors in the same room and have these discussions, much less to get any kind of unanimity in terms of the discussions that we have. But I can tell you, having worked in the dietary supplement and in the drug industry for north of 40 years, this industry has coalesced. You have set aside some of the fires of competition, and you recognize that the bigger goal here is to make sure that there is a marketplace that's legal for Kratom to continue to be sold in the United States. And that's, of course, our main objective. A key part of that, by the way, is that we maintain a safe and secure supply chain of Kratom raw materials from Indonesia. And frankly, there's a big puzzle in Indonesia. All of you see the conflicting reports that come out of Indonesia about what's going to happen to Kratom and whether it's going to be legal for export, notwithstanding the FDA's position. We'll talk about that in a little while. But Indonesia itself is a very complex country when it comes to evaluating substances like Kratom because of its conservative and religiously devout population, where they don't tolerate any kind of substance that has a psychoactive property. We have emphasized in the conversations that we have had with the Indonesian government that we are not seeking in any way to interfere with their domestic policy in Indonesia about whether Kratom should be legal there or under what conditions and terms that would happen. But we think, and obviously advocate for, is that we need to have a supply chain that is uninterrupted, that has safe products that are being delivered out of Indonesia into the United States. And consistently, what they say to me is, well, fix the problem at the FDA, right? And we should, we try. The biggest problem with the FDA in the United States today is that they decide that they are going to seize extraordinary regulatory powers that the Congress never intended that they would have access to. And a prime example is the FDA import alerts. We all know the history of this. The 9 deaths that occurred in Sweden in 2019 in a 12-month period, that cluster of deaths got the attention of every public health official in the world. It led to the unfortunate conclusion in some countries that led to an outright ban on Kratom. What was ignored by the FDA and by those other countries was the plain fact that those 9 deaths were actually caused by an adulterant that was added to the Kratom powdered product that was sold and was the suspect substance that was responsible for those deaths of an adulterant called O-desmethyltramadol. At the dose level, that O-desmethyltramadol, which itself is a powerful chemical formulation used in the production of the opioid tramadol, if you took that same dose and put it in your cup of coffee in the morning or a glass of orange juice, you'd be dead within minutes. The cause of those deaths had nothing to do with the Kratom, the Kratom itself. It was O-desmethyltramadol. We know from the scientific examination of Kratom that it is not deadly. It doesn't kill people. Now, we struggle sometimes with very absolute affirmations about what we know about Kratom. We say that Kratom cannot kill anyone, right? But we know that water can kill someone. If you take too much of it in a short period of time, it can upset your electrolytes in your body, and you can end up dying from water intoxication. So whenever we talk about Kratom in the context of a discussion about its safety, we have to remember that extreme statements don't get us very far, that within the context of the safety profile of substances which have been known in the United States to have problems if they are abused in some way, in its relative context, Kratom is very safe. We know that from the pharmacologic action, the examination, how it binds to the mu-opioid receptor in the brain, what its partial agonist activity produces, and what it does not. It does not give you a euphoric high. If you buy a Kratom product and you have that sensation of this euphoric high, you are not consuming a pure kratom product. It has been adulterated with something. If there is a respiratory suppression that occurs from the kratom product that you are consuming, you are not using pure kratom. It is obviously adulterated because kratom's alkaloids are partial agonists. They do not travel in any significant way to the respiratory system, and that is what causes opioid overdoses. It's not the actual drug itself, it is the effect on your respiratory system where you literally suffocate. And the FDA would like everyone to believe that that's exactly what kratom is. The import alert was imposed in 2012, despite the fact that the scientific article that was peer-reviewed and published by the Kronstadt group, the Swedish scientists and researchers, where they concluded that it was not kratom that killed those 9 people. The FDA used those 9 deaths as the basis for their import alert. They used those deaths in 2016 as part of their body count when they made the recommendation to the Department of Health and Human Services in conjunction with the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, telling HHS that they needed to transmit the recommendation for scheduling of metrogynine and 7-hydroxymetrogynine to the DEA because these were deadly substances. They used those 9 deaths and they added another 21 to get to 33, 22 to get to 33 deaths that they could, I'm sorry, my math's wrong, but you get to the 33 total. They used those 9. It is their duty in a 3-factor or 8-factor analysis, their absolute affirmative statutory responsibility to scour the internet and other public resources available and include all of that in any scheduling recommendation they made. The FDA failed to do that. The FDA, in fact, did not recognize the Kronstadt study, peer-reviewed and published, which outed them on their conclusion that, in fact, kratom was not responsible for the deaths of those 9 individuals. So they capitalized on that mistake, and they continued to promote to HHS and then to the DEA that in fact happened. We know what happened then. The DEA announced on August 30th that the next day, August 31st of 2016, they would in fact impose the scheduling recommendation. It was a Federal Register notice, and that's when I first got involved with the American Kratom Association. And I have confessed this before, I do it freely to you today. When they hired me, I told them, you have 0 chance of getting this overturned. There has never been, ever, a withdrawal of a scheduling recommendation by the DEA under the emergency powers section of the Controlled Substances Act. 82 previous recommendations had gone through. They're unique in that you only have to prove the 3 factors rather than 8 in a regular rulemaking process for a scheduling of any substance. There is no public comment period, and there's no judicial review. And I told the AKA that the only chance you've got is if you can establish a record by which you can challenge on the Administrative Procedures Act an abuse of authority of the FDA. What I didn't know is that there is this kratom community out there who unified, 146,000 strong, sent their petition signatures to the White House on the We the People site at the White House, which accepted those kinds of recommendations. When you get to 100,000 signatures on that, the White House is supposed to take action. What I didn't know is that there would be 6,000 people uninvited that contacted the Drug Enforcement Administration. Neither, by the way, did the DEA understand or in any way contemplate that that would happen. They were stunned. They reported to us that they had never seen anything like it. They didn't understand why this substance called kratom, which they didn't know much about, was being contested by that group of people in that large a number in that short space of time, because 30 days after publication, this rule was to become effective. They also didn't contemplate that there would be 51 members of the Congress that would object to what was going on. They didn't know that 26 Republicans and 25 Democrats in a bipartisan way would sign that letter. They didn't know that 13 members of the United States Senate would sign the letter, with Orrin Hatch, then one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, since retired from the state of Utah, signing the letter. And on the other side, we had Bernie Sanders, who we know is one of the most liberal members of the Senate, signing the same letter, telling the DEA it was inappropriate to schedule kratom. Now, that tells you that this is not a partisan political issue. This is about an overextension of the regulatory authority of the FDA. And that's something that really speaks to the real problem we're dealing with. The FDA import alert was interesting in that it took the unprecedented step of banning all kratom raw materials. The law itself is designed to allow the FDA to identify a single vendor that is exporting from their country a specific product that's contaminated. The burden of proof that the FDA has to have is on that single vendor that's doing that. What they've done is ban all kratom raw materials, and they do it for a couple of interesting reasons, which I'll discuss in a second. But they went far beyond the regulatory authority that was contemplated by the United States Congress to allow them to do it. But it puts us in a real fix, because under normal circumstances, under an import alert, the individual vendor is able to petition the FDA and ask for a release of the import alert, and there is a procedure that's outlined in the FDA guidelines that allow regulations that allows them to do so. They have to have 5 commercial quantity shipments come into the United States. 5 of those, all 5 of those have to be tested. 2 or 3 of them can be FDA independent inspections and subject to spot checks. So that's the law. How can we go to the FDA now and say we want a release from kratom raw materials, right? There's nobody that is on their red alert list. It's just kratom in general. That is an abuse of their authority, by the way, and something that really ought to be changed. But here's the reaction. In the kratom community, we're entrepreneurs, right? We have to be flexible. And so the flexibility was evidenced in the decision made early on by many vendors to say we can avoid the import alert by putting on the labeling of the shipments coming from Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries to say this is not for human consumption. And today, I still see vendors who are using that designation as a way to get around the regulation that the FDA has on the import alert saying you're not allowed to have it. Well, you are opening yourself up, if you do this, for a case of fraud. And that was evidenced in the case that was done up in Detroit, Michigan by the FDA, where the importer, and in this case, the individual that was actually saying not for human consumption, was also processing kratom, and so they stuck him with a fraud charge because obviously his products were designed for human consumption, and the labeling that he provided on his products was exactly that. Everyone who uses this trick to get around the FDA and hopefully avoid what the customs people are doing is opening yourself up to the potential for exactly that. You'll have a fraud charge laid on you, and that will be disastrous for you personally and for your business. So it's important that we do this right. I recommend that anyone has a question about this issue to go to the AK website and find Michael Werner's webinar. He's an attorney with Holland & Knight, where he describes exactly how you should be handling these kinds of things in order to avoid being nabbed by the FDA on the import alert because of the way that you are characterizing the actual import. Here's the problem that we have in Indonesia. This is a picture that was taken of the way that after the leaves are picked, that they are then dried. Now, there's a washing procedure that goes on as well. There are not many sites in the growing areas in Indonesia where you have clean water available in order to wash those plants. That's a magnet for Salmonella and E. coli right there. And then the drying process after the leaves are washed. Now, this is the way that they were doing it about 3 years ago. Things have improved, thankfully. But this is a lady that's out there spreading out the leaves to make sure that they dry, because obviously wet leaves create all kinds of problems that are unrelated to the actual plant itself. Mold comes in from these wet plants if you don't dry them properly. And so they spread them out on tarps, not sanitized. There's the worker here is in the middle of the leaves. There's no foot booties, there's no gloves, there's nothing that's going to stop the contamination. And laying it out on the ground obviously puts it in jeopardy of being exposed to the small reptiles over there that apparently are purveyors of Salmonella, and we saw a lot of that. And so obviously that's part of the problem. Today, things have increased dramatically or improved dramatically, although I wouldn't say that it's completely done yet. We need to do more work, and particularly in the area. So here's part of the problem too. In Indonesia today, there are brokers that are going to the individual farmers and they are soliciting their business where they will buy their kratom from them and then they will sell it to the processor, alleviating the farmer from having that responsibility or the burden of doing it. My understanding is that many of those brokers are exploiting those farmers And the blame is falling heavily upon the vendors in the United States. When I have discussions with the Ministry of Agriculture staff, they complain about it in every call that we've had over the past 2 years, that we've got to do something to clean up the supply chain. They do not accept responsibility that perhaps it is the brokers that are part of the problem as well, who are exploiting the farmers. But we obviously have a challenge in order to get that. So the exchange of money is really, really important in terms of how we establish a secure supply chain that respects the farmers along the way. Another problem we have is Facebook business. I get, and I'm sure all of you do too, but I get 24 emails a week telling me, you want to buy Kratom. And I'm Johnny Farmer over in Indonesia, and I will sell you Kratom, and it is the purest, cleanest, and best Kratom, most powerful in the world. Some of them even add their therapeutic claims about how it's going to cure me from all kinds of things. I get them all the time. And you look at that and you say, how much of the business of Kratom coming into the United States is through Facebook and through internet platform personal sales to consumers or to small vendors in the United States? In best we can tell from surveys that we've done with the farmers over in Indonesia, that it may be between 15 and 20% of the total business. All of that's off the books, by the way, of any kind of record keeping that is done by the Ministry of Agriculture in their assessments of how much Kratom is imported into the United States from Indonesia. 95% of the total supply coming to the United States is from Indonesia. They estimated in 2016 or 17 that the average monthly tonnage, metric tons, was about 380 to 400 metric tons a month. And that, of course, generated, based on consumer surveys in the United States, average consumption per day, a user population here of between 3 and 5 million people. In mid-2020, it is now 4,850 metric tons of Kratom that is being exported into the United States from Indonesia. A dramatic increase. And that, of course, is part of this population that's growing, which we now estimate between 11 and 15 million people. And part of that is a perverse outcome of the FDA's attention to it, right? They wanted to ban it. They've been careful, they've been fighting this battle for so long. Facebook business is a problem that we've simply got to address as we go forward. I want you to meet Bang Edie. Anybody know Bang?
Yeah, he DM'd me on Instagram.
Yeah, you know Bang?
I know of him.
Hey, Pete. Is Pete here still? Pete Cameron. So the American Kratom Association doesn't know Bang either, but Bang says that he works at the American Kratom Association. Right? Now, this is his credibility card, right? He says, you can buy my Kratom, it's clean, and the American Kratom Association, I'm one of their people, I'm working with them. That, and I'm going to use a legal term, ladies, and I apologize, but that's bullshit. Now, that's what happens. That's what you're getting. So if Bang is willing to say that he works for the American Kratom Association, what else is he lying about? Because he's telling you his product is clean, it's tested, it's inspected, you can trust it. And if you trust it, you shouldn't, right? But that's what we're facing here. And you see that is going to undermine the marketplace in terms of credibility with consumers, but it's going to do something even far more insidious. It is going to get the attention of the FDA, because the first time that we have a consumer that shows up through the FDA safety portal, a report about an adverse event that comes from Kratom that's sold through the internet, the FDA is going to come out and say, that's why we have this ban in place, because there is no ability to control what is coming out of Indonesia. And it is exposing people to health risks that are unacceptable. It doesn't mean that the FDA is right, it just means they have the power to do it. And we have simply got to do all we can. So we've been working with various ministries in Indonesia to improve this so that we can, at the source, try to improve the ways that they harvest, the way that they dry it, and the way that they grind it and process it, they package it and ship it. Those are all important things. In order to get off the import alert, we're going to have to be able to say to the FDA that we can trace every shipment of Kratom back to the farm. We've got to prove to them that if there is a salmonella or E. coli or heavy metal contamination, we can trace it back. We've got to have in place, and this is where another dramatic improvements are occurring, we've got to have processing done by food grade grinders, not World War II era coffee grinding machines that use gears that are plated with nickel that flake off into the kratom raw material when it's processed, and therefore we have some of the problem with heavy metal contamination. We've got to take responsibility for that. And the Indonesian government recognizes it as well. They are working with us, trying hard to find the right training programs, the right way to make sure that all kratom, no matter which broker picks it up or how it's processed, that when it arrives at the port for export, that we have some controls over it and to be able to ensure the FDA that we're acting responsibly along the way. If not, this is what we get.
Hey, got it. It's only vitamins. Vitamin C, like an orange. If you don't want to lose your vitamins, make the FDA stop. Call the U.S. Senate and tell them that you want to take your vitamins in peace. If enough of us do that, it'll work.
So for those of you that are old enough to remember this was a part of the advocacy battle that occurred in 1994 when the United States Congress was responding to the Food and Drug Administration's attacks on vitamins and dietary supplements. The FDA at that time was saying the same thing that they say about kratom today. It is contaminated, it's killing people, they're extremely dangerous, and their solution was to ban all vitamins and dietary supplements in America, force them through the sieve of the new drug application process, which of course the FDA makes a lot of their money on in terms of subsidizing their operations. And so that was their goal. Congress, seeing things like this and seeing the output of advocates, there were 300,000 calls that occurred to the U.S. Capitol switchboard on one day that literally shut down the U.S. Capitol switchboard. They had to revamp their entire telephone system to accommodate future kinds of things. That happened over the fight over the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, which was a bill that said no to the FDA. You don't get to ban vitamins and dietary supplements. You get to have some regulatory process in which you can participate. And that's what happened. The Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, after the 300,000 phone calls and over 700 or 800,000 letters that were sent into the U.S. Congress, emails weren't available as they are today, in order to do that kind of advocacy work. The result was, and I know people say that this is fictional, it was a unanimous vote of the United States Congress, unanimous in both houses, to pass the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. If the FDA could repeal that bill, they would do so today. They hate it because it puts restrictions on their ability to overreach their regulatory authority. Today, they're outside of that process with kratom because they will ban or stop any new dietary ingredient notification that's submitted to the Dietary Supplement Office at the FDA, and it does not matter how good the quality of the data that you provide showing the safety of kratom. They don't care. Jack Henningfield and I participated in a FDA hearing out in Bethesda, and the assistant director of the Dietary Supplement Office was in the hallway, and so Jack and I went up and chatted him up. And Jack Henningfield said to him, "Why is it that you're stopping even legitimate NDIN applications for kratom?" And he said, we will never approve one until the guy upstairs, meaning at that time Scott Gottlieb, approves it, because he's on a tear about kratom because it's an opioid. That's what the FDA's position is, that kratom is an opioid. Kratom is an opioid. and that it is, they morphed the language when we discredited that position from a scientific basis. They now says it has opioid-like effects. Okay, what does that mean? Well, they say it has the effects of creating sedation. Cough syrup has opioid-like effects, right? Well, because it relieves pain. Tylenol relieves pain. Did they call that opioid-like? They go down the list of these attacks on kratom, and they try to demonize kratom by calling it an opioid. And what does that mean? When you're the average American sitting out there and you know that the #2 public health crisis in America today, and only second to COVID, is the number of people that are dying every day from opioid overdoses, exacerbated in large part by COVID itself because of the isolation that people are in and the aggravation of all of the issues that people seek help from by using drugs and opioids. They also say that kratom is addictive, right? That is not true in the sense of the criteria required under the Controlled Substances Act. Now, can you get addicted to kratom? Yes. It is more a dependency in typical use. You will find that weaning off of kratom, according to the study done by the University of Florida with Dr. Brennan, that the effects of kratom withdrawal are far different than an opioid. And his documentation shows that it's much like a caffeine withdrawal, which is a week of a headache, upset stomach, maybe a runny nose. It's not like an opioid withdrawal, which we know can be horrendous, which we know has lots of negatives attached to it that are terribly telling on the individual. But the FDA likes to say it's addictive. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse challenged that finding. They decided, after we outed them about all the deaths, they decided at NIDA that they were going to do their own independent 2 animal studies. They thought it was important to do 2 because they wanted the validation. They wanted it fast, so they ran them concurrently, but they were independent of one another. Both studies, first is the HEMBE study published in June of 2018, which said there was no addiction liability under the standards set by the Controlled Substances Act for which a recommendation for scheduling would be based. No addiction liability. But the interesting finding was that they saw in the test animals a reduction in the cravings for morphine, which was the reference drug, validating the fact that there are people in the United States who report that kratom helps them withdraw from opioids. Of course it does. That is a therapeutic effect which an individual is allowed to make a decision about without the interference of the FDA. Now, I'll talk a little bit about commercial speech and why you can't say that, but why an individual consumer can do it. And then the second study, called the U study, was published a couple weeks later in July of 2018, and they came to the same conclusion. They had a little different word. They said there's no significant addiction liability. Same conclusion about the reduction in cravings for the reference drug that was used in the study, which I think were methamphetamines in that study. So there you have the conclusive proof that the argument made by the FDA that this was schedulable was done in 2018, and the NIDA people withdrew their support and told the HHS people that we're out of the game. We don't believe that this is a valid scheduling request by the FDA, and they told the FDA the same thing. So the FDA lost their death data. The 44 deaths were bogus. We FOIA'd and got all of those deaths, independent review of those deaths by an independent toxicologist. She confirmed that all were polydrug use or adulterated kratom products or an underlying health condition. They were not kratom alone, and the FDA was wrong, and they were lying to the American people when they said it. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse did their own evaluation of those 44 deaths, and they concluded the same thing. And they published it. They published it on their website that say these are all polydrug use, adulterated kratom products, or underlying medical conditions. The FDA went ballistic because now they saw the layers of the criteria under the Controlled Substances Act being eviscerated before their very eyes and exposed them for their false narrative about kratom. Now, you would think that would be enough to say, okay, we were wrong, right? They don't. The FDA continues to fight as we go. In 2018, we finally were able to convince the Assistant Secretary of Health at the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the official transmitter of any scheduling recommendation allowed by the FDA and NIDA that is actually sent to the Drug Enforcement Administration. We met with the Assistant Secretary of Health staff. Dr. Jack Henningfield went through an absolutely magnificent description of the science. On each point, undermine why the FDA's claims about the schedulability of kratom were wrong. And at the end of that meeting, they said two things. One, we need some additional information, and we provided that to them very quickly. The second thing they said was, that was compelling. That was compelling. And so I followed up for 6 months and asked that office over and over again, what's the status? Because we believed that they were actually going to rescind that recommendation. And each time I was told nothing to report, nothing to report. You hear about, I just mentioned the 44 deaths. You then hear about no approved medical uses. This is the other criteria under the Controlled Substances Act. No approved medical uses. Well, that's because it's a food. And the FDA has no pre-approval authority over foods. They only have the ability to control the compliance with good manufacturing practices and adulteration of food products. They don't have the ability, but they have to have that statement in there in order to justify a scheduling recommendation because it's one of the criteria. So they just said, they threw it out there. And I hear it all the time from state legislators. They say, well, the FDA says there's no approved medical uses. That's proven the negative. Of course they say that. They're wrong, by the way, in that that's not the criteria. It's not that they're not wrong that there's no approved medical uses. No one's asked them to approve for a medical use. And to say that statement is really stretching the criteria. The right way to look at this is that kratom is, in fact, not a medicine in the traditional sense under the criteria that's been expressed. Kratom is a food under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Its proper classification is a food. Now, it does have therapeutic effects. Absolutely does. No one argues that. And herein lies the problem that we have as a kratom industry, and that is the commercial speech that is used by marketers of kratom to sell their products. An individual, the American Kratom Association, can say whatever we want about the therapeutic effects that kratom will provide to consumers. In fact, the largest hits that we get on the AK website is searching for vendors that sell safe kratom, right? They want to be able to buy it. They want to buy a pure product, but its therapeutic benefits are things that a vendor cannot say. And by the way, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is very specific about what you in fact can say and what you cannot say in terms of kratom being a food. But if you are GMP compliant, you are contaminant free, and you have proper labeling, you can sell kratom as a food. Now, again, that food tricks people sometimes. They say, well, how can a food be in a capsule, or how can it be in a beverage, and how can it be in a powder? Well, it's the classification that was set forth by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the technical application of, because it is not a drug. It is not a dietary ingredient. It is not a food supplement. It is, in fact, in its utilization, just a food. If you look at the issue of whether kratom can be a dietary supplement, the answer is yes. If, as a vendor, you want to apply for a new dietary ingredient notification, which I referenced earlier, which the FDA is not accepting currently, but it costs you about $500,000 or more. You have to prove the safety of the product, right? And if you want to formulate a product that is then made available as a dietary supplement, which gives you one advantage, it allows you to make a structure function claim, right? Not a therapeutic claim, but a structure function claim, which talks about how it helps your mood. And there are a couple of things that you can say. And again, that's a little flexible standard the FDA sets. But under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you can, in fact, have kratom be a dietary supplement. If it's produced, you prove the safety, you file the NDIN, structure function claims, GMP compliance, and you report adverse events. That's an obligation if you're a dietary supplement manufacturer. Kratom can also be a drug. If you want to file a new drug application, if you have the $5 billion, $3 to $5 billion put down, and if you want to wait 10 years, you can. Now, by the way, there are pharma companies chomping at the bit to do this. They are watching Dr. McCurdy's studies out of the University of Florida closely to see if there is a way that they can synthesize chemically the alkaloids in the kratom plant and then be able to make a new drug application. But a key to it is the economics of it. There's no pharma company that sees a benefit in going through that investment in that period of time if kratom is available on the marketplace to everyone, because you can achieve pretty much the same effect. Even if they produce a chemically synthesized version of the alkaloids, they still have competition. And the one thing pharma companies don't like is competition. They don't. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing right now with the FDA. The FDA's position here is that they think kratom is a dangerous and unapproved drug. And they get away with that because you will find kratom vendors who on their websites say kratom will help you with fibromyalgia, it will help you with arthritis, it will help you cure your opioid addiction. I mean, you see them all the time. I go on every week and make it a point to look for those kinds of claims because they are killing us. And a vendor, by the way, because it gives the FDA all this justification to keep saying this is what this marketplace is doing and we can't stop it because we've tried and we can't stop it. They all do it, right? You see it from these small farmers in Indonesia saying it, and then you've got vendors in the United States that are saying it, and they should not be saying it. Now, you have a responsibility as a vendor to make sure that you take control of every platform, marketing platform you use to sell your products. So if you have a blog on your website and someone writes in and said, thank God for your product, it has saved my life, it saved me from all this pain that I had from a back injury, from an accident. That is an impermissible health claim because under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it is interpreted as an inducement for someone else to buy it based on that comment that's made. As true as it may be, you are not allowed to do it. That's banned commercial speech that has been litigated through the courts, and you can't stop it because that's what the FDC Act provides. Unfortunate, but true. Private speech, individual speech, you're allowed to do it, but you just can't, if you manage a platform or control it, you can't allow those comments to be made. I know there are kratom vendors who are ticked off to no end because we tell them that, and they say, who is the government to restrict my speech? Well, it's the FDA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act passed by the Congress that says they absolutely can because it's designed to protect consumers from being induced to buy a product that may be unsafe or not qualified under the new drug application process. And you are presumptively not qualified if you have not proven the safety through animal testing and human clinical trials. And that's the key. And those are expensive, obviously. The FDA also says it's an opioid because it hits the new opioid receptor in the brain. It's nonsense, but that's what they say. And they say that kratom is killing people, which also is nonsense. We know is nonsense. And just to give you an illustration, when we asked for the 44 deaths, which is the current body count that the FDA has put out, when we asked for that data, they gave us one that was completely redacted, literally blacked out, except for the case number at the top of the page. We asked why. They said, well, that is an autopsy report that the family has invoked the HIPAA restriction. That's the federal law that protects privacy. So you're not getting that autopsy. I said, okay, nothing we do to appeal that, right? It's done. So about a month and a half later, I got a call from a Huffington Post reporter, Nick Wing, who was doing a story on kratom, but he was actually researching a completely different FDA-related story. And he called me and said, Mac, I had that autopsy fully unredacted, and I got it from the FDA on a different database than the one that they were drawing from on kratom-related deaths. That's interesting. He said, I'll send it to you. He said, I'm going to do a story on it first. Well, the story was fascinating. The story was that this individual that is a kratom death today, to this day, is listed as one of the 44 on the scheduling recommendation from the FDA, which they point to repeatedly. That death occurred in a drug sting. The individual that they were targeting was selling marijuana. And the officers surrounded the car. There were two individuals in the car. They ordered them to come out of the car. Both refused. And at some point, the officers say there was a mention of a gun in the car by one of the occupants of the car, and they opened fire. The individual that's listed by the FDA as a kratom death died of 2 gunshot wounds in the torso. That's a perfect illustration of how far the FDA will stretch their story in order to conform to their narrative, their false narrative about kratom. They ought to be ashamed of themselves and maybe prosecuted for it because there actually is a law, that's the Information Quality Act, that says that a federal agency that disseminates information that they foreseeably know will result in a public policy decision that is based on false information cannot do that. And yet the FDA gets away with it. It's stunning on the way it's done. And here's our great friend, Scott Gottlieb. Let me get this to advance. Now this thing's frozen. Try it. Oh, there we go. So Scott Gottlieb, when he was the FDA commissioner, you saw him all the time on there talking about how terrible kratom was. Here he was saying the kratom's deadly risks to, and he had this great story. And of course, people listen to the FDA commissioner. Why wouldn't they? The FDA has this great trust in the American people. They are there. They control a significant portion of the economy. Scott Gottlieb would not lie. And so therefore people believe him and they point to him all the time in terms of what he says. This one was interesting. This is a tweet that he put out on August the 17th of 2018. It says, if you or a loved one are addicted to the opioid kratom, treatment options are available. And they talk about FDA-approved medications, which of course are pharma drugs. Combined with counseling behavioral therapies can help regain control of your life, transition to one of sobriety. Please consult your doctor, and then he gives a link. August 17th of 2018 was the day after the Department of Health and Human Services, the designated authority to make a scheduling recommendation, formally withdrew the scheduling recommendation from the Drug Enforcement Administration. We found that out from a whistleblower just a month and a half ago. Scott Gottlieb was out telling a lie that he knew was a lie, that in fact the Assistant Secretary for Health said that the FDA had failed to meet the burden it had on science. And in fact, since their application for a scheduling recommendation, which was done on October 17th, 2017, since then, new science has emerged that contradicts the FDA's position, and they were withdrawing it because of the failure of the FDA to meet its burden. And then the letter went on to describe how it's not really an opioid, that there's a lot of disagreement in the scientific community about its effects, but no contest about the benefits. And in fact, the Assistant Secretary for Health said that there are significant public health risks of people dying if you schedule this product now. And the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, the day after that letter went out, which he kept secret from the American people for more than 2.5 years, he made that decision. He told the HHS secretary, assistant secretary, that he didn't want this letter actually released based on an exemption to FOIA that's called regulatory review. He kept it secret for more than 2.5 years, even after he left. The FDA has been promising HHS that they're going to be able to meet the burden that was outlined in the letter. They have not, they cannot. It will be years before they can meet that. And it was a person who called and said, this letter is out there. I said, but I can't give it to you because the FDA has restricted it. He said, but a member of Congress can get it. And so Congressman Pocan, along with a colleague, sent a letter requesting. Congressman Pocan from Wisconsin is our friend, our champion. He's terrific. He called me and said, Mac, he said, you're punking me. He said, you must have written this letter. I said, no, I haven't seen the letter. And he sent me a copy, and now all of you have it available. And if you don't have it, you can get it from the AKA. It is damning on the FDA's position. It calls them out for what they are. They were lying to the American people about kratom's pharmacological action and the made-up stories that they made about the deaths and all that, because if they were going to say that that was the basis for scheduling, you'd have a plethora of scheduling recommendations if the standard that they applied to kratom were applied to other substances. It's nuts, and yet they got away with it so far. The Biden administration, a lot of people say, what's going to be the difference between the previous administration and the Biden administration? The truth is that kratom is not a political or a partisan issue. It is one that has a significant potential to alleviate a public health crisis in the opioid addiction community. And by the way, let me emphasize, we do not oppose the use of opioids. It is a valuable tool in the war chest of physicians to be able to help people manage acute and chronic pain. We do not say opioids are bad on their face. We think that the people that suffer from opioid addictions, once they get treatment, becomes the problem. And kratom is an option. It is an option that ought to be freely available because we know of the addiction profile and we know the problems that come from it. The war on kratom by the FDA is a brazen attempt to extend their regulatory authority, and they simply shouldn't have the authority to do it. The FDA commissioner nominee of the Biden administration is going to hear a lot from the kratom community and from our supporters in the Congress when they question him about, he or she, about what their position is going to be when they become the FDA commissioner. Because when they cross that threshold at the FDA headquarters, they're going to be bombarded by the policy staff that hates Kratom. They've hated it for a decade or more, and they're going to continue to fight that battle internally. We need to simply let it be known to the new FDA commissioner that they've been wrong. The FDA's war on Kratom is all based on fear. They want people to know, and they justify their attack on Kratom by saying that it's salmonella infected, that's going to kill people. They want people to know E. coli, heavy metal contamination. Those are bases for doing it. The FDA mischaracterized Kratom as a food additive, a dietary supplement, or an unapproved drug, whatever fits their narrative to answer a rebuttal on that given day. And they spread it across the spectrum. They don't ever stick to a story that actually makes any sense. The FDA's view of Kratom is that it is the monster plant. That's their view. And they're not going to back down until they're forced to back down, which is why we've been engaged in this effort for now since 2016. So I get asked all the time, what's the biggest single threat to Kratom remaining legal in the United States? Well, here's the answer to it. One is, and this is an example of scientifically documented evidence that, for example, in diabetes, the biggest problem in diabetes management is that people take their medications and then they feel better and they stop taking their medications. And then they end up with all sorts of horrendous health problems because they failed to be adherent to their medication. Well, I think that's analogous to what's happening today. We've had some great victories. We beat the FDA in 2016. They weren't able to schedule Kratom, right? We beat the FDA recently, actually happened back on August 16th, 2018, where the scheduling recommendation was withdrawn. We know that we're winning in the states. We know that in 2019, there were 4 states, Utah, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, that passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act with overwhelming numbers. That once public policy officials get to see what we do, see the science, and see the safety profile of Kratom, they willingly say that we can appropriately regulate it to make sure that consumers are not exposed to dangerous products. They're willing to do this. 2020 killed us with COVID, and so we've had to reconfigure our advocacy operations. Today we're in 31 states. We're trying to advocate for the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, including the 6 states where Kratom is banned right now. We have a bill that's filed and now being considered in the Vermont legislature. In Wisconsin, it was filed in the Senate Health Committee, same health chairman this year, where they opened a bill filed to repeal the ban and replace it with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. In Rhode Island, the public health director opened up a formal review of the ban on Kratom, and we have 2 bills filed with the House and the Senate on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. We're working now in Arkansas. Alabama's tough. We've got lobbyists on the ground. It's going to be a 2 or 3 year process there, but maybe sooner if we get these other states on board. It's unanimous in the Oklahoma House of Representatives. It was near unanimous in Missouri. We're seeing great progress in moving forward with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. So it's easy for us to sit back and say, no problem. Things are great, right? Now, behind the scenes, we have this enormous effort that's going on in order to make this happen. So our 2016 laurels, about the 140,000 petitions, 6,000 calls, 51 members of Congress, 23,232 comments to the DEA, that's history. In 2021, 4 states passed the KCPA 19. We've introduced it in more than a dozen states that have a reasonable chance of passage. Congress and NIDA both support Kratom research, and HHS rescinded the scheduling. So what we can't be is Nero. We can't sit by and watch Rome burn. We also cannot sit by and watch the other guys put up the resources that are needed to sustain this effort. We cannot do that. I know it's easy to do it. You can say, oh, those guys are bigger than me. Those guys are more effective than we are. We're just a smaller guy. It's easy to say that, but it's a mistake, because if your boat is floating and Kratom is legal today because of the efforts of a few, we need more to pitch in and help us. And by the way, at the end of the meeting, you're going to hear from Vernon Jones, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his own personal experience about how we work on these efforts and what it takes to do it. Today, we have a monthly budget for lobbying activities of $284,500. Now, that will last for the first 6 months, and then it'll go down because most state legislators end after 3 or 4 or 5 months. But that's a significant burn rate. You're in business, you know. To raise that kind of money in order to sustain a needed lobbying effort takes the support of a lot of people. We need your help along the way. Thank you to everyone that's done it so far. We need to renew and to redouble our efforts along the way. So what's the outcome? All of you are in business, you want to make money. We get that. And there's nothing, by the way, wrong with that, despite what you may hear from some in Washington about profit motives being evil. You are entitled to make profit. You are entitled to sell safe, clean, Kratom products. You should do so without interference by the government. But you have a consuming population out there that also wants to be able to do it. If a person wants to use it recreationally, like you would a cup of coffee, they should be free to do so. If they use it in order to balance their moods and reduce anxiety, as long as there's not a therapeutic claim associated with the sale of the product, those consumers should be able to do that. If you are trapped in the addiction cycle and you find Kratom to be effective in helping you wean off of opioids addictions or to replace opioids completely, you should be free to do so as an individual citizen. The Johns Hopkins study that was concluded in January, published in January 2020, found that among adult Kratom consumers that were using it for the purpose of weaning off of an opioid addiction, 87% reported significant reduction in their withdrawal symptoms. 35% said they were opioid free within a year. How can anyone ignore that? Nora Volkow, the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, doesn't. She knows it. She said it's absolutely the way it is, that we need to continue to study Kratom. People are using it effectively. The United States Congress knows it. They put in their report language in both the 2020 and 2021 budget bills, specific language that says that we should study Kratom, and they've allocated money for a human clinical trial for Kratom. This is progress because we're educating policymakers about not only the lies being told by the FDA, but the truth, and its difference, by the way, the truth about Kratom. And that is going to be our salvation as we go forward. There's a famous author that talked about, and I'm really stealing this from Senator Kurt Randall, talked about how when the storm was gathering, that the whisper in the ear was that, be afraid because the storm is coming. And the answer back was, we are the storm. And that's what the Kratom consuming public, that's what the Kratom vendors are. You are the storm. And we need to bring the wrath of that storm down on the public policymakers in Washington, D.C., in state capitals around the country, and in little towns and cities that is now the target of the FDA. The FDA is going and selling their nonsense to medical coroners, to health departments, to the police departments. I stood in front of the Monument, Colorado Town Board of Trustees and listened to a member of that Board of Trustees say, well, we put our ban on Kratom in effect because we don't want our kids to have access to Kratom. And they said, what difference does it make with ban it here? Because you can just go down the street in Colorado Springs and you can buy it there. Well, and what if Colorado Springs took that attitude? And what if the county took that attitude? And pretty soon it's all gone, right? And yet the benefits, and he heard testimony from Monument, Colorado citizens saying how it had saved their lives. How one mother told me, and I related it on her behalf because it's banned in Colorado at Monument, told her that we are in fact, that her family was saying her son was an addict, that he got his family back. He's a father to his son, he's a husband to his wife, he's employed again, and his life was in the trash barrel before that. And yet he wants to talk about family values. And this is what we fight against when you see the credibility of the FDA, when you see people attach to the FDA that kind of credibility. They should not, and they do not deserve that kind of credibility. We need to be the ones fighting back, being that storm going forward. And so that's our goal. We are active in lots of states. We ask you to help us. I just had a conversation with our group from Texas about next week. It looks like we're going to get our hearing on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in Texas. They're asking the lobbying team down there for Kratom consumers to step up and testify, for retailers to step up and be witnesses, for the Kratom community to rise up. And I've told them in thousands of testimonials that I have heard in dozens and dozens of legislative hearings across the country, the Kratom community is willing to rise up and tell their story. And it's a powerful story. And it moves people, it moves legislators. Without them, these legislators sit and they start, you see them on their iPads or on their Surface devices or their computers. They're typing while we're introducing the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and they're Googling Kratom. Is there a worse source of information? Although it's gotten better, Is there a worse source than to go to Kratom and see the FDA says Kratom is dangerous? The Mayo Clinic says Kratom is dangerous. WebMD says Kratom is dangerous. Now, what they don't know is that there are information sharing agreements between all of those groups. They pair with each other. It is a cycle. It is a feedback loop, but yet everybody gives them independent credibility. And so our goal is to rise up and say no more. The truth will prevail, and that the Kratom story is going to be told the way it should be told. And so we are grateful for your help. I can tell you we're Facebook Living this event to thousands of Kratom consumers. It'll be recorded and published. We're ready to tell our story. We're not afraid to tell our story. We're not afraid to tell the FDA they're wrong and that they're lying to the American people about the safety profile of Kratom. Stand with us, be with us, and we hope you'll do that. We'll conclude at this point, and we're ready to wrap up. Before I invite Vernon Jones to come, any questions anybody has? I'm glad to answer anything that you have.
Any new states that you think may be switching from illegal, or from being illegal to legal?
I think we have an excellent chance in Wisconsin, in Vermont, and Rhode Island. I think Arkansas, we're back in a little bit of a loop with the public health director and the surgeon general there, but a good chance there. No chance in Alabama this year, and no chance in Indiana this year. But I think we have a good chance of getting 2 or 3 that are currently banned, and then we'll let the others fall. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What can the average everyday Kratom consumer do to support what you guys do?
So the question was, what can the average everyday Kratom consumer do to support the American Kratom Association and what we're doing here? We have an advocacy program that we call the Kratom Consumer Council. It's organized by congressional district. All 435 congressional districts are organized and the states are organized. Join that if you're an average consumer. Obviously, we welcome your contributions as an average consumer, and it's part of the lifeblood of what we do to keep us on the road and telling this story. That's important. And tell your testimonials. Share them with us. Record them on your phone. Send us an email, because we share them with legislators across the country and with these local governments along the way. I had a conversation with the mayor's staff in San Diego City last week, and they're interested in reviewing their ban on Kratom, which was done in 2016 as a part of the SPICE deal. We're making inroads, and we're fighting every day against the FDA. In Mississippi, which is the hotbed of anti-Kratom activity, there was a county that took the courageous action of rescinding their Kratom ban. We can win these battles if we get public policy officials and we have the resources to get them out there. So thank you for that question. Anything that you can do in those 3 categories would be great.
Are you soliciting lobbyist groups by state, kind of subcontracting your effort down and kind of rifle shooting in where you think you have a chance to win?
So the question is, are we subcontracting the lobbyists in individual states where we think we have a chance? We have prioritized the states. Some because states pop up. Tennessee was an example. Tennessee popped up with a bill that was filed that we think is terrible generally, because it's a Trojan horse in our view for restricting the volume of Kratom that can be sold at any given time. It was advocated by the pharmacist, and I was told that the pharmacist's real goal is to get it behind the counter at a pharmacy. That's the only way to sell it. That's obviously not a good solution. So we're going to work there in that state. So that's an extraordinary one. But we do contract with lobbyists that know the state legislatures, that have influence with the leadership in those legislatures, and that's where the expenses come in, because we're paying lobbyists, and depending on the state, varying amounts of money, but we have to contract with them, and they want 6-month contracts minimum to do it. So we do that on a selected basis, and then we try to rely on individual states. There are vendors who underwrite the lobbyists in their state, and we deeply appreciate that. That works. We have a great vendor community that is willing to support us. They're not telling us what to do. They just say, we'll pay whatever the lobbyist represents the American Kratom Association. But they trust us enough, and that kind of support is absolutely critical. Okay, so one last question. Yes, sir.
On the radiation, do you have, are you looking into that? I mentioned it the other day, just product coming up from the radiation that's irradiated. Are you seeing any issues or the stamp that is required?
Great question. So the question is, does the AKA have a position on irradiation of Kratom raw materials that originate in Indonesia in their attempt to try to clean up the kratom supply. This is a very difficult issue because the FDA has standards about irradiation and it depends on how irradiation is applied to a kratom product. We are working, trying to figure out what that right standard is to advise the Indonesian processors about how this should be done. So it's an open question at this point. Very interested in getting the right answer. Jack Henningfield is investigating with the FDA sort of what their standard would be for a food product that is granulized into a powder and what their radiation standards would be for it. So we don't know yet, but we're working on it. Great. So let me do, to conclude this, and this is part of the storm. In Georgia, when we went to the Georgia legislature and asked for the Kratom Consumer Protection Act to be considered and passed, Vernon Jones was the Georgia representative who is himself a kratom consumer and who has been an advocate for kratom for a long time and helped in previous states where bans were being proposed, stepped up and took the challenge to not just fight a ban, but also to be proactive in the passage of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And the result was that it was a 164-to-1 vote in the House, and it was unanimous in the Senate. I do not know why Vernon let that one vote get away. He's going to have to explain that for himself. But there is not a more passionate, there is not a more vigorous proponent of kratom than Vernon Jones. And all of you have seen him. He is his own man. He doesn't let parties shackle him, obviously. He doesn't let the attitudes of other people to restrain him in any way. He just expounds and is an evangelical preacher about kratom. So Vernon, come up and say hello to everyone.
Thank you, Matt, for that line. You know, Matt and I have been knowing each other a long